Continue the conversation with two experts in the field. I am a lucky lady this morning. John Tashjian, principal of Centurion Real Estate Partners, and this other John is still with us as well. John Lyons, he is the CEO of Savills. So, John T., I want to start with you. Yesterday's housing numbers, we talked about this just a second ago. Not as promising as we would have expected. What does that mean moving forward? Are we ever going to get back to levels we saw last year?
We will, but last year was just different than this year. I mean, what happened with yesterday's numbers was the overriding number was reasonably promising. It was up 3.7%. Some people are just explaining that away by saying February was a very cold month and it was a very difficult time for sales. So what we really have to do is cut through to the underlying numbers. And when you start to look at the underlying numbers, you start to think that the housing market is like the little engine that might, you know. And
it's not the little engine that could.
It's not nearly.
But what about the engine that could? Because the government has spent a ton of money trying to fix this up, and that hasn't really worked.
It hasn't. We saw a blip last year when the government intervened with tax credits, but what you have now is you've got this very slow uphill recovery. Well, let's not call it a recovery just yet, but uphill trend. And we're dragging behind it the sins of the past, all this excess inventory. And so
how do you get rid of it? Can the government bulldoze it?
That was a question that was posed yesterday, I think, on Squawk Box. And I remember sitting there thinking, who came up with that? I mean, what academic came up with that? I think that that's an economist's solution to a practical problem, which doesn't really work. I mean, John.
Yeah, it seems to me, John, that really the primary issue here is the availability of credit. Credit's going to help us get out of this. Is there credit right now for the housing market? How does that come back? Where do we stand?
There is credit, but it's very tight. And when you look at the numbers yesterday, let's talk about what we saw. 33% of home buyers were first-time home buyers. That's down from 44% last year. Now, part of that is the tax credits that ran out in March of last year, but it's also it also is well below 40%, which is where I think we'd be comfortable.
All right, fine. So if you don't want the government to get involved with this excess inventory, how do you get rid of it?
If the government wants to get involved, they can get involved by easing credit. That's the way out. You have to ease credit because it has to become more available. You have to have lower down payments available. I'm not talking about 1% and 2% like we saw in 06 or 0, but lower down payments and a lower cost to carry. That's how we find our way out.
Is that what you're saying?
Absolutely. I think John's right on this point. There has to be availability of credit in order for the consumers to buy these assets, and it's very hard when the credit's very tight. So the issue for the government is how do they help subsidize this without recreating the sins of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac?
Right.
But what about the other side of this story, where the likes of Caterpillar, that's of course linked to housing, they're saying that they're doubling housing starts because they don't have enough homes. Obviously, that's the case in New York, where vacancy is under 1%, but then you look at a place like the Inland Empire of California, and it's a completely different situation.
It's a totally different story.
Oversaturated.
I mean, we're in a situation where you've got the haves and the have-nots. In California, 51% of all sales last month were distressed. In New York, it's a completely different phenomenon. New York, San Francisco, Washington, microeconomies that have their own demand generators are completely different. There also happen to be 3 areas where there were high barriers to entry for new development last cycle. And so you've got increased demand, a better economy, and a lower supply. And we are in a supply-demand imbalance. That's what we're in. And until you clear that supply-demand imbalance, there's no growth.
It's not by the government, you say. Ross has a question.
John, how long is it going to take to clear that supply-demand imbalance?
To clear?
John Tashjian, yeah.
Well, the first thing we have to do is look at the shadow inventory. And shadow inventory numbers, are estimated around 1.9 million units. And not all shadow inventory becomes a foreclosure inventory, but foreclosure numbers are going up, not down, in 2011. So I think we're looking into 2012 before we can start to see anything that we could call a recovery in overall housing. Now, some markets, like I said, will do better than others. But in markets like Detroit, Cleveland, Atlanta, Las Vegas, where all pricing is still below 2000, there's a far longer period that we're going to have to wait.
One other aspect, I do think that you're beginning, though, to see the consumer, the average typical American, that's feeling a little bit more bullish on their ability to afford a home. The multifamily sector in the United States, occupancies are at almost record levels, and as you see those rents begin to rise for multifamily units, you're going to see people starting to look back to inexpensive single-family homes across the country.
I will really quickly say we have an email question in from Anthony who says the government needs to ease credit, question mark, question mark, question mark. Fannie and Freddie are in this shape they're in because of easy credit.
Well,
So
Fannie
it
and
cuts both ways.
Without doubt, Nicole, you're right. And Fannie and Freddie is an entire hour-long conversation.
It is. How about we have one another time?
I'd
We're
love
gonna
to come
have
back.
take a break.
Another time. Okay.
John and John, we appreciate your time. Thank you
Thanks
so
very
much, gentlemen. All right.